Hey everyone, how's it going? I come to you with a discussion video / response video. And this video is in response to 4 different videos, I believe, now that have been posted on the subject. And they were all spawned by a video that Steve Donahue made. He, in his maybe mid-rash announcement video, made some mildly inflammatory comments, and I of course say inflammatory playfully. This is respectful disagreement, of course, all of it. So Steve made his maybe mid-rash video, said some inflammatory things. Noah from Everyone Who Reads It Must Converse made a response video arguing with a lot of what Steve said. And Tom at LA Books also made a response video arguing with some of the things Steve said. And then Steve made a video responding to the responses. So there are 4 different videos now. I'll leave links to all of them. They're all really good. And I kind of want to throw my hat in the ring, because all these videos make arguments, make statements that I would like to respond to, and some of which I would like to take issue with, and some of which I would just like to, again, comment on. And so I'll start with Steve's video, just so you all know sort of where this all comes from. So in Steve's original, maybe mid-rash announcement video, he argues that all religious people, in fact, know what it's like to be an atheist. He says that, if you are a Christian, you don't believe in the Hindu pantheon, right? Or if you are a Muslim, you don't believe in the bodhisattvas in Mahayana Buddhism or something like this. And so every religious person knows what it's like to be an atheist towards the God in every other religion. And that's really what got people going. And that's really what I think ruffled people's feathers. And it ruffled my feathers too. And I will just say that I'm an atheist, so technically I have no horse in the race, but I think it's important to have our ideas defined well and to be respectful of how people self-identify. So the way that I see all the different diverse gods throughout history, I see them all as manifestations of the same impulse to worship. I see them all as different manifestations of one underlying sort of feeling, idea, whatever noun you want to apply to the idea of God. And of course, when we say God as a singular thing, obviously that's imperfect, because there are polytheistic religions, there are monotheistic religions, there are things like the Trinity, which are, where God is both 3 things and 1 thing at the same time, and it's not supposed to make sense. I fully believe that, if a Christian who eats meat were to speak with a Hindu who's a vegetarian, and they could get past those very, very small details about the differences in their belief, like the vegetarianism thing, that they would find a lot of common ground in their religious faith with each other. Or a Muslim who doesn't drink and a Jew who does. If they, again, got past those little details about their religion, they would find a lot of common ground in their belief in God. And so I see the many diverse manifestations of belief, kind of like different methods to reach the same end. No matter what kind of worship it is, it's all meant to do the same thing, and the belief in something higher is also just meant it is manifested in many different ways in many different places. And so Jason and Felicia, for example, are not atheists because they believe in this higher power that other faiths also believe in different, their belief manifests in different ways. And so that would be my first gripe with Steve, is that the idea of God is much larger than I think he's giving it credit for. And so that's my first thing. The other thing I wanted to comment on was something a bit more mundane, but something that I also find very interesting, and it's that Steve talks about the distinction between an atheist and an agnostic, and he actually says that if you're an agnostic, then you are basically just an atheist, because his definition of atheism is that you don't believe in God. And when you're an agnostic, you can't decide either way, right? That's the definition of an agnostic, someone who won't decide either way whether or not they think that they believe that God exists. And Steve says that even having that position makes you an atheist, because an atheist is just someone who does not believe, and if you aren't sure either way, then you don't believe. So therefore, if you're an agnostic, then you're an atheist. And I see where he's coming from with that, but I also think it's important to respect people's self-identification. And so if someone wants to identify that way, that's fine. But that's a bit beyond the scope of what he's saying. But what I actually want to talk about is this distinction between the soft atheist and the hard atheist that Steve makes. So he distinguishes between soft atheists who say that what they say is just, I've never been presented with evidence of a God, therefore I don't believe. And so, with this suggestion that if they were presented with some evidence or had some experience that convinced them or gave them a faith, that they would change their mind. Whereas a hard atheist, believes that God has been disproven beyond the shadow of a doubt. And I actually think that that's a false distinction. I actually think that soft atheists are hard atheists in a similar way to how Steve says that agnostics are also just atheists in disguise. So, if you think about how scientists reason, think about whether or not you believe in the Loch Ness Monster. I don't believe in the Loch Ness Monster because I have never seen a photograph of it, I've never seen a video of it, I've never seen any personal testimonies of having encountered it that have convinced me that it exists. And so I do not believe that the Loch Ness Monster exists. If you better believe, though, that if I were shown a photograph, shown a video of it, I would change my mind. And to my mind, that's the same reasoning as the soft atheists have. And so the soft atheists are hard atheists. I guess the difference really, to my mind, is just semantic. And yeah, so that was my, not gripe really, just commentary, I suppose. I'm not trying to pick a fight or argue with Steve on this point. I'm just offering my own commentary on it. Now we really get into the weeds with Noah's video. And the part of Noah's video that I really want to respond to is where he starts talking about scientific materialism. And he makes a series of assumptions about scientific materialism. And I think he distinguishes scientific materialism from science. So scientific materialism is the idea that the only thing that exists is the material world. What we can see, hear, feel, touch, taste, so on. And that's the only thing that exists. And that we can trust we can trust our sense experience of that world. So, and I think he distinguishes that from science, which is obviously a method of gaining knowledge. Science is not in the business of proving much of anything. It's in the business of gathering data from which we glean suggestions that we can then make hypotheses about future events. And if those hypotheses are sustained, then we turn them into a theory about how things work, and so on. Science is a method of acquiring suggestions for what might be the truth, for acquiring verisimilitude, for acquiring ideas about the world that are as far from being false as possible, basically. But scientific materialism is different. It's more of an assumption of science. And so I want to start with a few different statements that Noah makes. I'm going to sort of paraphrase what he says, but here they are. He says, science is based on faith, meaning faith in the same way as religious people have faith. Science is a belief system, again, in the same way that religion is a belief system. Science is based on just as much dogma as religion. And Steve does a great job of responding to this in his second response video. So I direct you to that video. He responds to it very, very well. Okay, so I want to make a couple of distinctions here. There's a difference between faith and trust. So faith is belief in something that you will never see, hear, taste, touch, anything. You will never be able to reach out your hand and shake hands with your God. That's what faith is. Trust is seeing the usefulness of something that has provided useful conclusions in the past. So science has done a lot to increase our knowledge of the world through its method. And so we trust that it will continue to do so. And that is different from faith, because we've seen the outcomes, and we can see the outcomes for ourselves. We can do experiments for ourselves. We don't have to take it on faith or anything like that. So there's a difference between faith and trust. But what I also want to take issue with is that idea that science or scientific materialism is based on dogma. So science is based on assumptions, which are different from dogma. Dogma is, a list of beliefs that you have to subscribe to in order to be considered a Christian or a Jehovah's Witness or something. That is what dogma is. Stuff that you just have to take on faith, that you just kind of have to take someone's word for. Science is based on assumptions, and a lot of these assumptions are not really actually tenable. So, for example, the idea that we can trust our own sense experience has frequently been called into question. I study psychology, and we do a lot of research on just how untrustworthy our attention span, our sensory experience is of the world. But, you can go all the way back to someone like Descartes. I think, therefore I am. People like him didn't even think we could really prove that anything outside of our heads existed. And so the idea of science, to someone who believes that, is nonsensical. And science is also based on a logical fallacy. It's based on the inductive fallacy, the idea that the past always predicts the future. So there's deductive reasoning, where you have a set of premises from which your conclusion follows. So Socrates is a man, all men are mortal, therefore Socrates is mortal. That's a deductive argument you have. It's very neat, self-contained. You don't need anything else to show that your conclusion is true. But inductive reasoning is where you use past events and their outcomes to make suggestions about what will happen in the future, to generate hypotheses about what will happen in the future. Easiest example of this is the rising of the sun. So you wake up every morning, you assume that the sun is going to rise. Why do you assume that the sun is going to rise? Because it's risen every morning of your life. But that may not, in fact, be the case. You may wake up one morning to find that the sun does not rise. You might move to Alaska, for example, without knowing what winter there is like. Or the sun may fizzle out, or the sun may be knocked off its orbit. And if either of those things happened, we would all probably be dead in short order. But assuming that we don't die, there is a possibility that we will wake up and the sun will just not rise. So that's the inductive fallacy, the idea that the past always predicts the future. And scientists know this. You learn about the philosophy of science, it's built right in. But these are assumptions that we make because they're useful. It's in our best interests to assume that we can, to some degree, trust our sense experience. It is in our best interests to assume that in many cases the past predicts the future. And someone may say that that is an act of faith, but again, there is 200, 300 years of scientific findings that act as good reason to hold those assumptions, whereas religious dogma or faith do not have that same kind of evidence in their favor. So anyway, that was my main gripe. Steve does a really good job dealing with this. And then I just want to touch on something else that Noah leans in toward, which is this idea of the God of the gaps. So he starts talking about, the example he uses is junk DNA, how a lot of our DNA is basically useless, it doesn't do anything, and we don't really know why it's there. And he says that there are these unexplained aspects of the world like that science hasn't explained yet. And he argues that science asking us to believe that it will figure that out is, again, an act of faith. But he seems to almost suggest that because science hasn't explained that there must have been a design, this argument from design. But this idea that because science has not yet explained X, Y, or Z aspect of the world means that there must have been a God to design it is brought up all the time by religious people trying to lay out a real argument for why God exists, and it never really works. Because, hundreds of years ago, we thought that the Earth was 6,000 years old and that every single animal on planet Earth was created by God 6,000 years, or in the West, I guess. People believed that. But then the theory of evolution was created and that was all blown out of the water. So then religious people started to say, well, maybe it was God who put evolution in place, right? And maybe it was God who initiated the Big Bang or something like that. But again, you're just being moved further and further back, And again, like I said, science may not all figure everything out. That's not what I'm saying. But supposing that because science hasn't figured something out, it must be God, it just never works, because science is based on the premise that we don't know everything. So of course it doesn't know everything. Yeah, so that is just not a great argument for the existence of God. And Noah and Tom both also make this further statement that the fact that so many different people from across time, place, and history have had religious faith gives them faith in a God, you know, that seeing so many people have this faith is somehow evidence for there being a God. And again, that kind of argument is just not logically consistent, because it's a circular argument, okay? So your conclusion, your evidence that you're giving is based on the assumption of your conclusion being true. So you can think about it this way. Why do you think that there's a God? Well, because all cultures across all times have, you know, thought that there was a God. Why have all cultures across all times thought that there was a God? Well, because there's a God. That's the circular argument. And so again, it's not logically consistent. And of course, all of this is beside the point for a lot of religious people. I think for most religious people, faith is more about feeling than it is about laying out logical arguments. You know, we've had so much ink and breath wasted between people arguing for the existence of God, right? I mean, right? You can go read Thomas Aquinas, his 5 proofs. You can go read Saint, I forget what the name of the saint is, but the ontological argument. You can go read the God delusion on the other side. I think for most religious people, belief is not about logic and reason. It's more about feeling. And I'm totally fine with that, okay? I just think that religious people need to stop trying to come up with arguments for the existence of God, and atheists need to just stop arguing with them. So anyway, and I know that that's somewhat undercut by the fact that I made this video, but I find talking about it very interesting, and I just wanted to sort of make that point at the end there. And you know, what Noah says in his video too, I think what he's trying to say is that even atheists do need some kind of meaning in their life. And again, I'm on board with that. I think every person does need to find some sort of meaning in their life. But again, that's different from religious belief. You know what I mean? I find a lot of meaning in the books that I read, in the music that I listen to, in the movies that I watch. I find a lot of meaning in my relationship with other people, in my conversations with other people, in nature, and so on. But it's a far cry from religion, I think, even though it is sprung from the same sort of anxieties and impulses as religion is. Yeah. So, but anyway, so that's my video. I hope it made some degree of sense, but I will leave it at that. Bye, guys.